Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today's Virtual Enlightenment Salon stream features a compilation of two of my presentations delivered virtually at the Vanguard Scientific Instruments and Management, VSIM, conferences in Ravda, Bulgaria, held on September 9th, 2023, and September 11th, 2024. I'm always grateful to Professors Angel Marchev Sr. and Angel Marchev Jr. for the opportunity to present at these conferences and for the thoughtful exploration of transhumanist topics that occurs there. I will be presenting again at the VSIM 2025 Conference on September 9th, 2025, and I offer the previous year's presentations as a way to highlight the forthcoming conference and raise interest within the broader transhumanist, life extensionist, and futurist community as to what will be discussed there. My 2023 presentation is entitled, What Needs to Happen to Save Civilization by 2025? And it is interesting to watch in retrospect, as I had suggested that certain events would need to happen by our current time in order for a long-term civilizational decline to be averted. You will see that none of these events have occurred yet, although peace in Ukraine is probably closer now than it was in 2023. But more broadly, by many indicators, Western civilization, and especially the United States, are backsliding further, as chaos embroils our lives on what has essentially become a daily basis. COVID is essentially ignored in the United States, even as it surges. The Trump administration, under the anti-scientific Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is now denying access to life-protecting COVID vaccines to many Americans, while defunding research into COVID mRNA vaccine technology. Political elites continue to play the cynical game of demonizing and scapegoating minorities and those who do not think like them at home, and inventing phantom threats from foreigners abroad. Far from seeing nuclear disarmament or a no first use policy for nuclear weapons from the United States, we are seeing an escalation of nuclear saber rattling by the Trump administration. At the same time, no major problems in our society are being solved. We continue to have a rampant inflation crisis exacerbated by Trump's illegal tariffs, and a rampant cost of living crisis, particularly in areas such as housing and healthcare, again exacerbated by policies that suppress construction, growth, and innovation. These policies are cheered on by political partisans on both the Trumpist right and the degrowth left, and they harm ordinary people who are just trying to improve their lives. In the midst of all this, death and disease continue to claim good people, including many people whom I have known or whose work I have followed over the years. For now, Western civilization is clearly in decline. Life in 2025 is worse than life in 2015. The only bright spot is generative AI, but it too is subject to a backlash of tremendous hatred and fear by those who are ignorant of both its possibilities and its limitations as a tool. Do I still think that it may be possible to reverse course and prevent a trajectory of decline, much like the Roman Empire experienced in the aftermath of the Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 CE? I think so, but it will require extraordinary effort, and no major institutions, political parties, or conventional cultural factions will be able to do it. Channeling the course of civilization in the correct directions is up to us, transhumanists. My 2024 presentation, Overcoming Polarization Through Transhumanism, describes a major reason why civilization has taken a wrong turn, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, namely The political polarization, which has intensified since that time and has poisoned most aspects of Western life and especially American life. Again, it is up to us transhumanists to overcome the heinous polarization between left and right and offer a compelling alternative vision that is free from the toxicity and perpetual focus on demonizing the other, which is what animates both left-wing and right-wing partisans. The transhumanist vision, the upwing vision, needs to become the next cultural paradigm, and for that to happen, all of us need to contribute our efforts. One glimmer of hope, which has seen major progress in 2025, is LEV the Game, the computer game on longevity escape velocity, which is significantly further along in its development and now available to play for free. In July of this year, I traveled to both Dublin and Las Vegas and presented the game to an enthusiastic reception by attendees. I discussed the game in my 2024 VSIM presentation, back when it was at an earlier stage of development, and I look forward to hearing in 2025 how the conference participants experienced playing the game and what insights they derived from it. As for my 2025 presentation, perhaps it strikes a bit of an optimistic chord despite all of the chaos. For now, I will only reveal the title, The Progress of Artificial Intelligence and Why Humans Will Not Be Made Obsolete Anytime Soon. We humans will continue to have an active role in shaping our future if we choose to take up the responsibilities that such a role entails. Enjoy my 2023 and 2024 Vanguard Scientific Instruments in Management Conference presentations.
Let me introduce our first speaker, Gennady Stolyarov II, chairman of US Transhumanist Party. More details you could see on his bio on the wall. I will not read it at the moment. This is the main descriptors of Gennady profile. He is very regular participant in our conferences. This is a picture of an old conference, quite old. Gennady also, on a very regular basis, is organizing every Sunday very detailed, the most detailed discussions on transhumanist topics with political accents. And also he is chairman of the Transhuman Club, which is discussion club for all sorts of discussions. So, Gennady, you have the floor, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Angel, for the honor of presenting as the opening speaker at the VSIM 2023 conference. I am happy to be here virtually as always, and I am happy to discuss what I consider to be an immensely important topic, namely the topic of the existential risks facing our civilization and what we can do to ensure that we all have the best possible future. But in order to have the best possible future, we also need to avoid the worst possible future, which is the annihilation of the human species. And last year, in 2022, I gave a presentation entitled Passing Through the Great Filter, How Are We Doing? And this is a bit of an update to this presentation. In that presentation, I made the observation that humankind appears to be in the midst of a great filter, essentially a set of challenges and a uniquely existentially risky period that if we overcome, we have a strong chance of becoming a multi-planetary or perhaps even intergalactic civilization with remarkable growth potential, with open-ended lifespans, with open-ended prosperity and abundance. But we also face threats that could destroy our species and could terminate our opportunities to pursue any sort of future whatsoever. So what has happened in the year since then? Well, civilization did not end in 2022, and we were quite fortunate. I think this is an occasion for celebration. However, there were multiple close calls last year, And moreover, now is not the time to relax because we are not out of the great filter yet. And I will explain what I mean by this. In October to November of 2022, I'm of the view that humankind faced peak existential risk. That is to say, never before was there such a risky moment in history, not from the standpoint of the number of people who died from wars or other kinds of cataclysms, but from the standpoint of what was the probability of human extinction during that time period. And I will also try to make the case that we won't ever quite face the same high level of existential risk again, though I do think we still face some significant existential risk and will be facing it for about another year and a half. So in October of 2022, on October 7th, there was quite an alarming article published by Max Tegmark of the Future of Life Institute, which he entitled, "Why I Think There's a 1 in 6 Chance of an Imminent Global Nuclear War." And this was in reference to the situation in Ukraine at the time, when in response to successes of the Ukrainian counteroffensive at the time, Vladimir Putin was threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And this wouldn't have been a strategic nuclear strike against Western powers. This would have been a tactical nuclear deployment in Ukraine. So at that time, Max Tegmark estimated a 30% probability of a tactical nuclear strike with an 80% probability, if that tactical nuclear strike happened, of a forceful NATO response. And then subsequent to that, there would be a spiral of escalation, which with 70% probability would just keep building on itself until there was full-fledged nuclear war. So if you multiply 30% by 80% by 70%, this would have given a 16.8% probability of nuclear war at that time, or slightly greater than 1/6. So in effect, the world was playing a game of Russian roulette, and there was a 1/6 probability of an event that would, in all likelihood, have brought about the extinction of our species. Now, fortunately, our timeline is one of the 83.2% of timelines approximately where that did not happen. And I think the reason for that is that Putin realized that deploying tactical nuclear weapons was not in his best interests or anybody's best interests. It wouldn't have given him any sort of advantage on the battlefield in Ukraine. But there was an incident on November 15th, 2022, which, in my view, qualifies that day as the single most existentially dangerous day in human history. What happened was an errant Ukrainian missile from the west of that country struck the village of Przewodow on the Polish side of the Polish-Ukrainian border, and it killed 2 people. And this was very unfortunate because these 2 Polish civilians essentially were just living their lives. They did absolutely nothing wrong. But this missile was fired, I suppose, in an attempt to provide some sort of air defense against Russian attacks, but it ended up landing in Poland. But immediately, many Western, US, and Eastern European commentators were just blaming Russia reflexively and calling for activation of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And even the Polish government was essentially initially saying, well, it's really likely that the Russian military fired that missile. Fortunately, as I had anticipated last year, Joe Biden does not really want nuclear war or nuclear escalation. He does want to help the government of Ukraine and the military of Ukraine, but the Biden administration has been relatively cautious about any action that would provoke nuclear retaliation. So the Biden administration actually conducted a rather quick and fairly objective investigation of these events and concluded that, yes, indeed, it was a Ukrainian missile. And oddly enough, the Eastern European powers that were calling for activation of Article 5 of the NATO treaty against Russia, all of a sudden were very quick to forgive Ukraine for what was clearly an accident. But it would clearly have been an accident no matter which side had fired the missile, because no rational leader would want to risk triggering a world war because a single missile crossed the border. So actually, even the Russian military has been very careful not to let any sort of residue of the war spread into the borders of NATO countries. But I think this speaks to the nature of the risk that we're facing. It's not that either side in this conflict wants a nuclear war. It's that accidents can happen and misunderstandings can happen. And the previous lines of communication that existed, even during the peak of the Cold War, the lines of communication that enabled Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis to directly speak with one another and reach a negotiated arrangement that averted nuclear conflict, those lines of communication have been heavily frayed, to say the least. And so it's not a guarantee that if another incident of this sort happens, there wouldn't be a serious escalation just because of a lack of the kind of restraint that would have been the default previously. So I say this was the single most dangerous day in human history, not because any side wanted nuclear war, but because it could have easily escalated out of control. And there was significant clamor from even everyday public opinion in the Western world for some sort of immediate and harsh retaliation against Russia, which would have triggered a nuclear war had that been the course of action that was pursued. So we need to tread extremely carefully in the ensuing months and years. And fortunately, a similar incident has not recurred since that time. And the war in Ukraine has reached a kind of stalemate. There is an ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive, but it is very slow going. Territory is changing hands essentially one village at a time. And when territory changes hands at that pace, that's very much like what has happened in many historical wars. And generally, it would not provoke the kind of retaliatory response that could escalate into a nuclear war. But if either side makes a major breakthrough, this may still change. So we're not out of the great filter yet. But during last year's presentation, I asked, what got us into the great filter? When did this uniquely existentially risky period begin? And since observing the developments of the ensuing year, as well as considering how we got there, my conclusion is the COVID pandemic is responsible for the uniquely existentially risky period that humankind finds itself in. Because all of the most dangerous events of the past few years would not have occurred were it not for COVID. And there were many reasons for this. So the fear of contracting COVID led Putin to isolate himself, to reject feedback from everyone except his inner circle, who were often more militaristic and more eager to launch this invasion of Ukraine than Putin himself was. And Putin made a massive miscalculation in his decision to invade Ukraine because he thought there would be essentially an immediate capitulation and he would take over Kiev in 3 days. This obviously did not happen. And I think just from a self-interested perspective, if Putin had known the extent of Ukrainian resistance, if he could have anticipated it, he would never have launched this invasion. It would not have been in his best interests. But he isolated himself from true information about the facts on the ground. Furthermore, the COVID pandemic, because of the massive death toll, created a situation where human life became devalued in the Western world because of mass death and live public acceptance of it. If one considers that in the United States now over 1.1 million people have died from COVID, and in the world over 7 million people have died, casualties in Ukraine have been an order of magnitude lower than that. And even though the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in a war in Europe have not been seen for many decades, by contrast with what is happening at home in the United States and what has happened in many Western European countries. Still, the deaths of people in Ukraine, both Ukrainian civilians and Russian soldiers, and some Russian civilians as well, but many soldiers too, were just recently civilians who were drafted against their will and forced to fight in this rather pointless conflict. Those deaths are easy to de-emphasize and minimize for people who have gotten habituated to death all around them during the COVID pandemic. Furthermore, the COVID pandemic disrupted supply chains. It led to massive shortages of goods, some of which have yet to be resolved, and massive price inflation, some of which has yet to subside, as well as scarcity of labor. So many people were unable to fulfill some of the needs that they were accustomed to easily fulfilling in Western economies. And this normalized suffering. So when Western populations were told by their governments, well, you need to accept a lower standard of living because we need to support Ukraine in this fight. So you need to accept higher costs of energy. You need to accept some deprivation. They, for the large part, went along with it because they were already habituated to suffering on that scale. Furthermore, the COVID pandemic fueled a lot of domestic unrest, both on the part of the left wing and on the part of the right wing. And we saw this in American politics in the form of the urban riots of the 2020s, which were instigated by factions of the American left, as well as the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, which was the work of essentially right-wing fanatics. And the ruling classes were quite upset at this turmoil, and they saw this public discontent essentially threatening their own rule. And I think often in these cases, war is seen as a viable way to distract the population, to unite them against an external enemy so that there would be less threat to the ruling elite at home. And I think the war in Ukraine has been used both by Putin and by Western governments in this manner to cement their rule at home. The COVID pandemic also entrenched zero-sum thinking because of the trade-offs involved in responding to the pandemic. No matter what decisions were made, somebody would get hurt. People would lose their lives, or they would lose their livelihoods in the event of a lockdown. And the pandemic furthermore normalized acceptance of collateral damage from policy decisions, the idea that a hard choice would have to be made, no matter what direction that choice would be made in. And so in this climate of normalized collateral damage, the deaths of civilians in war could easily be rationalized in the same way. And I would argue the major powers politicians right now do not care about the massive suffering of civilians in Ukraine. They do not care about the massive suffering of draftees that are forced to fight in this war. There have been major stresses to ordinary people in coping with this pandemic, and that means less time, less energy to organize any sort of effective resistance to a perceived irrational government policy. So we haven't seen massive anti-war protests in the West the same way that we saw, say, with the Vietnam War or with the Second Persian Gulf War, where literally millions of people went out to protest against wars that were generally smaller in magnitude than the current conflict in Ukraine. So COVID, I think, placed us on the precipice of existential risks, even though COVID is not itself an existential risk. So the SARS-CoV-2 virus by itself cannot destroy human civilization. Most people who get it will recover from it, even though many people have serious lingering consequences from it as well. But what this pandemic did was it increased the probability of other existential risks, because in any given situation, COVID was a sufficient additional destabilizing influence that events that would have ordinarily likely resolved themselves in the direction of some sort of stable and recognizable equilibrium instead went in the direction of destabilization. So again, had the pandemic not occurred, had Putin not isolated himself, had Putin perhaps had input from the more liberal segments of Russian society and the Russian elite, would he have invaded Ukraine? I would say probably not. Would the populations in Western countries have tolerated any sort of involvement in a war to the extent that the NATO powers have been involved in Ukraine? Probably not. But it's a probabilistic kind of argument that I'm making. Furthermore, the general decade of the 2020s would have been extremely hopeful were it not for COVID, because the dominant narrative would have been technological progress, all of the advancements in AI, in medicine, in computing, in technologies like space travel, vertical farming, electric vehicles, alternative energy. And there would have been improvements in everyday life that would have reduced the appetite for political partisanship and warmongering. And I think in many cases, people toward the end of the last decade were becoming weary of political polarization and tuning out both the left wing and the right wing of politics. So to a great extent, this pandemic was very convenient to the conventional political elites who use this kind of traditional political spectrum to divide voters into demographics that could be easily targeted for purposes of capturing electoral constituencies. Historically, I believe there's a parallel to the COVID pandemic, which is quite troubling. And this was the Antonine Plague in Rome from 165 to 180 CE, which began essentially at the height of the Roman Empire during the start of the reign of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. But because of the massive death toll and the toll on the infrastructure of the Roman Empire of dealing with such calamity, the Roman Empire was set on a course of what turned out to be irreversible decline, even though many people, many emperors, many reformers tried to reverse that decline in the ensuing centuries. They could never quite gather the momentum to do that because the institutions were damaged in an irretrievable way. So Rome never fully recovered from the devastation of the Antonine Plague. And I see some common elements in COVID because this disease keeps recurring. The virus keeps mutating. It keeps reinfecting people. It keeps disrupting supply chains. It keeps disrupting the routines of life. It keeps threatening mass disability for people who were previously healthy. So my contention is, unless COVID is eradicated or rendered harmless soon, the best case scenario would be a gradual centuries-long decline with periodic crises. So that is if we avoid nuclear war during the next few years. And if we see parallels with the late Roman Empire, then by that sort of timeline, we might see a new dark age by about the year 2450. The worst case scenario is a much shorter term and more precipitous decline, where societal and political institutions are damaged so much in the short term that a mere misunderstanding causes nuclear war because the institutional safeguards that would have prevented it have been eroded. So how can we get out of this? We need to get rid of COVID as a public health threat. And fortunately, there's some hope. Actually, on my birthday, July 27th, 2023, there was some quite promising news from Duke Medical School. And I encourage you to look at this article from Duke Medical School entitled "Newly Discovered Antibodies to Neutralize COVID-19 Variants, Potentially Prevent Future Coronavirus Outbreaks." So what happened was there was a team of researchers in collaboration with the National University of Singapore, the University of Melbourne, and the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in the United States. And they isolated some antibodies from the blood of patients who had recovered from the original SARS virus, the one that affected people in 2002, 2003. And then they were also vaccinated against COVID. So they had this combined immunity. And one of these monoclonal antibodies, called E7, was particularly effective against all SARS-CoV-2 variants, including the Omicron variants. And the researchers hypothesized that E7 would be effective against all future variants of COVID as well. So if a treatment like that is developed and widely deployed, that means that no matter how the virus mutates going forward, there would be effective ways of dealing with it and preventing people from succumbing to it. So what does that suggest to us about how we can emerge from the Great Filter? I asked during my 2022 presentation, well, when did the Great Filter begin? And I gave a variety of possibilities. I'm increasingly convinced that we entered the Great Filter when the COVID-19 pandemic began. So that was in November of 2019. And I still maintain that July of 2022 was approximately the midpoint of the Great Filter. So if that's correct, we might be able to emerge from this period of uniquely high existential risk by March 2025. But obviously, that's not guaranteed. We don't have a crystal ball into the future. We need to meet certain preconditions in order to lift this cloud of existential risk. First, as I mentioned, we need a universal cure or vaccine for COVID, which is robust against all variants. And I wonder if, for instance, an mRNA vaccine could be developed that would target something other than the spike protein, or could target multiple sites on the virus so that mutation on one site wouldn't destroy the efficacy of the vaccines. But also we have a situation where many previously healthy people have become severely disabled because of long COVID, and there aren't even many good diagnostic tests for long COVID. But the probability of long COVID increases cumulatively with each infection. So unless we can protect people from becoming reinfected, an increasing proportion of humanity will have serious long-term disabilities, and they will not be able to contribute to the progress of our civilization nearly as much. But this kind of cure for long COVID is necessary to prevent the gradual long-term decline of our civilization that I mentioned. To prevent an immediate catastrophic decline, we need a negotiated peace in Ukraine. And it's becoming increasingly apparent that neither side really has the strength to win this war militarily, to achieve its stated objectives. They have fought one another to a standstill, and it's time to essentially let cooler heads prevail and to encourage people from both sides to sit down and figure out a realistic compromise where neither side would get what it wants, but each side would stem the bleeding. And I don't know to what extent the will exists on each side for such a negotiated settlement right now, but this is where external pressure can achieve some of that will. I think perhaps the greatest way to exert pressure on Putin's regime would be through China, because China is such a valued economic partner for Russia, and Russia's continued economic stability depends on support from China. But in order for that kind of pressure to work, the United States needs to avoid stoking tensions with China, which the Biden administration has unfortunately been doing. At the same time, public opinion in the Western world needs to shift decisively in favor of pressing for peace. And there needs to be de-escalations of tensions between the United States and both Russia and China, because honestly, right now, foreign policy of the United States is kind of goading an escalation with the two other greatest military powers. It makes absolutely no sense. But it would also be nice for the US to adopt a no first use policy toward nuclear weapons, because oddly enough, the United States is the only country in the world that officially claims the prerogative to have a first nuclear strike, even a strategic nuclear strike, even if the other side did not initiate a nuclear strike. And Putin was actually saying in December of 2022, well, look, we, the Russian side, actually only have a policy allowing the use of nuclear weapons in retaliation against an existential risk to Russia, but maybe we should emulate our American partners. And he was saying this as a veiled threat, but the reason why he was able to make it somewhat effectively is because of this terrible first use policy, which is frankly barbaric and which deprives the United States of any moral high ground in this conflict. So if the United States wants to regain a moral high ground, it should at the very least renounce a first use policy for nuclear weapons. But the best case scenario would be one of worldwide nuclear disarmament, one that was attempted in the 1980s through bilateral negotiations between Reagan and Gorbachev, later under George H.W. Bush. And that kind of approach led to a six-fold reduction in the nuclear arsenals of the US and the Soviet Union and later Russia. So we have a proof of concept that it can be done, but unfortunately in the past few years, the dynamic has been in the other direction. So that kind of dangerous trend of nuclear arms buildup needs to be reversed. So when the United States lifted the federal declaration of emergency associated with COVID-19 on May 11th, 2023, I used generative AI DALL-E 2 to generate this image of coronaviruses waving white flags and surrendering. It was a satire, as if a declaration of the end of this pandemic could undo the biological and medical reality on the ground, as if you could make this problem go away just by declaring that it is no longer an emergency. But COVID remains a massive public health threat. And we are in the midst of another wave, another surge of it right now, which should be a stark reminder to us that COVID and death are our enemies, not humans from other countries. And we need to be fighting the correct war. The correct war is the war against death and disease and ruin. And this is where the philosophy of transhumanism is particularly salient, because transhumanism seeks to transcend these tribal, national geopolitical hostilities and usher in a new era of humanity where we are actually focused on overcoming the common problems that we all face. So I would urge the leaders of all of the powers involved, but I would also urge the general public to seek a way to avoid nuclear annihilation, which I would argue is our greatest existential risk, because it comes at a time that could otherwise be an inflection point in human history. We are really on the verge of breakthroughs in longevity, in the ability to rejuvenate the human organism. We are on the verge of breakthroughs in terms of abundant, clean, renewable energy. We are on the verge of breakthroughs toward becoming a multi-planetary civilization. We're on the verge of breakthroughs in artificial intelligence that would enable us to solve many previously intractable problems. And we just have to not blow ourselves up and not allow an infectious disease to run rampant among us. And this is a race between the forces of progress and creation and the forces of ruin. So which side will we choose to support? I would say we need to overcome this great filter. I hope that I've given a bit of a roadmap toward doing so, or at least the prerequisites for doing so. And I hope that we can all live long and prosper after we emerge from the great filter. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Gennady. First of all, thank you very much. Acclamations. And second, questions and comments. Questions and comments, please. We have microphone system in the room, but the sound is intended for the room, not for my computer. So I will repeat the question, actually. Professor Kamen, sorry, without professor, sorry. Kamen, old friend, old participant in the conference, specialist in the field of territorial systems management. The question is, how Europe is looking like from the American point of view, from the point of view of the American society, and especially You look at our countries like Bulgaria, because in Europe there is a huge contrast in the modern Europe. So I'm interested in your opinion.
Yes, it's
because from the outside, probably the things will be better visible.
yes. I would say there is a contrast within Europe that I observe, and I would say this is a contrast between the attitudes that prevail largely in Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, particularly the countries that border Russia. So there's a history of tensions going back centuries between Russia and its neighbors. And a lot of politicians, a lot of public figures in Eastern European countries, particularly countries of the former Soviet bloc, want to take a very harsh stance against Russia and kind of, especially if they've joined NATO recently, they push for an escalation of tensions. In Western Europe, I perceive more reluctance because there were previous economic ties with Russia, say via the Nord Stream pipeline between Russia and Germany, which was blown up last year. But also, there is a kind of desire for a more independent foreign policy, independent of US influence. And this is particularly seen in France and in Germany. So I see the governments of France and Germany as having been somewhat moderating influences on this conflict. If you think about Emmanuel Macron going to Russia to negotiate with Putin before the invasion of Ukraine to try to avert it, that's one example. So I think there are some differences in perceived interests among various European countries. Now, I don't really see Bulgaria as being in the same position as, say, Poland or Lithuania or Estonia, because Bulgaria is not even under any remote threat from Russia right now. So I would really see the extreme outlooks as being from the countries that immediately border Russia, particularly Poland and the Baltic states. And those are the countries that are kind of exerting an influence on NATO as a whole to try to get NATO to become more belligerent. But I think most Europeans, most ordinary Europeans, just want to lead peaceful and fairly comfortable lives. And they are not particularly happy that this war is occurring. But as I mentioned, they may be more used to suffering than they would have been 4 years ago because of the pandemic, because of the economic disruptions, because they've lived through lockdowns and significant restrictions on their personal freedoms. So they're much more willing to just accept what is happening and see themselves as powerless to change it. This, by the way, is the prevailing attitude among the population in Russia. So I would say most people in Russia are not supporters of this war, despite what public opinion polls say. But if for generations one has learned essentially that if one voices one's opinion too vocally, too publicly, then one is going to face some serious consequences in one's personal life, to say the least, then one learns to conceal that. So if somebody calls one on the phone and says, well, what do you think about this war? If they're a supporter, they will say what is politically correct to say. If they're opponents, or even if they're neutral or have some reservations, they would prefer not to talk to the pollster because there would be nothing good that could come out of expressing a dissenting opinion. So one of my worries is that in Europe right now, the public is increasingly seeing itself as impotent in that way, that policy is being made irrespective of what the people actually want. And this kind of will lead the situation of ordinary people in European countries, both Western and Eastern Europe, to more closely resemble the situation of ordinary people in Russia. And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that can be averted, but it will take a shift in mindset. It will take a shift in attitudes toward what it's possible to accomplish politically. So I hope that gives some perspective, at least from the outside, what I, living in the United States, observe in terms of attitudes among the public in European nations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gennady. Any other questions or comments? Okay, no. Gennady, thank you very much. First speaker is Gennady from Nevada, a regular participant in our conference. That's his starting page. I would like to Gennady to point out that Gennady is just coming from RAAD conference. RAAD is standing for Revolution Against Aging and Death. It ended yesterday, so many of the participants also are actually in process of coming from this conference to shifting to our conference. So Gennady is a composer, science fiction writer, transhumanist, of course, chairman of U.S. Transhumanist Party, chairman of the Transhuman Club. Every Sunday, he is organizing very interesting salons on different topics of transhumanism. Last achievement of Gennady, and last announced achievement of Gennady is a new game about left, longevity, escape, velocity. After his presentation, I will ask him a question about that. It is a very interesting game and very useful, I hope. So, Gennady, you have the floor with your main presentation.
Thank you very much. I am quite pleased to present again at the VSIM-2024 Conference. This time I will present about a major problem that unfortunately may be delaying our ability to achieve the kind of civilization that we would want, and even threatens to undo a lot of the progress that we hope to achieve through science, technology, education, and improving conditions of human well-being. And that is the problem of polarization. And we see polarization that is really tearing apart our civilization. We see it manifest itself domestically in the United States, but also in other countries where this obsolete political spectrum of left and right continues to be utilized and continues to characterize how people and various organizations, various political parties see the world. In the United States, this polarization of left versus right has reached such intensity that I seriously think that on July 13th of 2024, we were literally inches away from civil war in this country. And had the completely misguided individual who attempted to assassinate Donald Trump succeeded, we would have been in a civil war in the United States. But one has to ask, what sort of climate of public opinion has to exist for some people to be motivated to take these kinds of terrible actions? What kinds of ideas have influenced people like that to lead them to lose any sense of respect for human life? That is how angry, that is how divided people in the United States have often become as a result of these tendencies of polarization. But the polarization is not limited to domestic politics. We see it in a geopolitical context, because we see once again a return to a bipolar world of sorts. In the Cold War, there was a bipolar division between the United States and NATO on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Warsaw Pact led by the Soviet Union. And now, once again, it seems that we are heading toward this kind of bipolar division, with the US and NATO on the one hand, and Russia and China on the other. And I believe there's a real threat of nuclear war arising out of the possibility of escalation of the ongoing war in Ukraine, which unfortunately has not resulted in any sort of peace and any sort of diplomatic settlement for over 2.5 years now. So I did present quite extensively my outlooks on the situation in Ukraine, both in 2022 and 2023. Today, I'm just going to mention it as an example of this polarization that is writ large. But beyond that, we see cultural polarization, where we have essentially polarization over lifestyle choices and over attributes such as skin color, or gender, or religion, or where one lives, such as whether one lives in an urban area or a rural area. These kinds of differences, even 20 to 30 years ago, would have just been seen as essentially part of the diversity in a given country. In the United States, certainly, there was a lot more tolerance of difference 20 years ago as compared to today, where we see the rise of this identity politics, where many people are encouraged to identify on the basis of circumstantial attributes and to, let's say, demonize or cast aspersions upon people who don't share those same attributes instead of trying to find common ground. So that's very troubling. And there are various causes of this polarization. There is a prevailing zero-sum mentality, which holds that for one person, organization, or nation to win, others must lose. And this, I believe, is an outgrowth of this highly suboptimal evolved tendency in human beings, which is left over from times of great scarcity, when perhaps the zero-sum mentality would have been more accurate. But instead of trying to create more wealth, trying to create more abundance for everybody, the people who espouse this mentality think that somebody else has to be deprived of something in order for them to gain. Then we also have material scarcity. Unfortunately, in recent years, especially since the COVID pandemic, but there have been events leading up to this as well, middle classes are being hollowed out. And I would say, especially in the United States, though we see some of these tendencies in European countries as well. Inflation, supply chain disruptions, and the lingering secondary and tertiary effects of COVID, the fact that people continue to get reinfected, the fact that people continue to experience lingering health consequences, are leading standards of living to erode, even though there have been some statistics indicating economic recovery under certain parameters since the depths of the pandemic. This recovery is certainly incomplete, and there is a dramatic difference in perception between what many of the official statistics say and how people actually experience everyday life. This reminds me to some extent of the experience in the Soviet Union and in the post-Soviet countries, where statistics were often embellished to show a picture that was in stark contrast to the day-to-day lives and day-to-day economic hardships that people faced. Now, in any situation where large numbers of people are struggling materially and experiencing difficulty achieving the standards of living that they want, there will be opportunistic demagogues who come in and exploit these vulnerable people. These people have genuine concerns, genuine grievances, but these demagogues convince them that there are some outside influences, some scapegoats, some groups who are different from them who are to blame. And it is essentially the oldest trick in the book to find some other, whether that be a person, a class of people, an ethnic group, and say, no, they are the problem. They are why you are suffering. And unfortunately, people who are in some cases distressed economically, are quite vulnerable to this kind of rhetoric. Also, we see a backlash by the power elite, the establishment. And the establishment is not always going to use this kind of demagoguery, but there is a fairly small power elite. In the United States, I estimate that it is comprised of about 10,000 people. And these are prominent people from both political parties and their donors and the media and to some extent the academic class, powerful people in think tanks who write various policy proposals that get enacted into law, the so-called military-industrial complex, which is very much a real set of organizations. Sometimes this power elite is known as the blob in foreign policy circles. This elite seeks to maintain its power, and it does so often by fostering polarization, by leading one half of the population to despise the other half. And another possibility is that this power elite might put forth a foreign adversary as being particularly threatening and being deserving of the hatred of the domestic population. So either the power elite will try to maintain power by causing division within the domestic population against itself, or it will do so by trying to motivate the domestic population to hate a foreign adversary. And this distracts attention from the monolithic policies that the power elite will seek to perpetuate, no matter which political party is nominally in power. There's also a principle called Duverger's law from the 20th century political theorist Maurice Duverger, who writes essentially that systems that are winner-take-all, where only one person wins the election and wins based on a plurality vote, and people can only vote for one candidate, these systems tend to result in two dominant political parties, because essentially each side tries to form a coalition of close to 50% of the population and tries to use the so-called lesser evil argument, that if you don't vote for the lesser evil, then the side that you think is the greater evil will win. And in reality, the two sides tend to become ever closer to one another in practice, while demonizing one another ever more intensely in terms of their rhetoric. So often this rhetoric is just for show among the politicians, and they don't really hate one another, but they want their rank and file followers to hate the rank and file followers on the other side. And that is, I think, really pernicious manipulation that gets performed. This is more of a problem in the United States than in parliamentary democracies, which often have viable multi-party systems. And there are some countries like Australia, for instance, that do have ranked choice voting that I will discuss later on. But I will point out the United States does export its political culture to the rest of the world. So if we have certain mentalities of polarization that arise in the United States, they could still manifest in other countries, even though the electoral systems of those countries are different. So moving on, there are some terrible effects of polarization. It's becoming increasingly difficult to hold civilized conversations about differences in views on issues affecting the broader society, because fewer people know how to disagree civilly and debate in ways that rely on rational arguments and evidence and logic, rather than just saying the other side is evil. Whoever disagrees must be in favor of these terrible things, whatever the propaganda of the day characterizes those terrible things to be. And furthermore, there's a wide realm of tastes and preferences that were previously considered matters of just private individual choice, and they've instead become signifiers of either the red tribe or the blue tribe. This could extend from the type of clothing one wears, or the types of stores one visits, or the type of food that one eats, or other kinds of purely personal tastes and preferences. And furthermore, people are increasingly misled into believing that there are only two options, that they have a duty to support a so-called lesser evil, though I'm not sure either of these options is actually the lesser evil, even if they mostly dislike the package that this lesser evil side offers, and they are pushed to accept packages of ideas or political programs that they do not personally support. They're pressured by politicians and by the media to hate those, even in their families, their neighborhoods, their social circles, people who have been their friends in the past, who would have otherwise been their friends, who show any of the signifiers of the other tribe, even inadvertently. So if someone happens to go to the wrong store or eat at the wrong restaurant, now that's a social risk. And sometimes what that is will shift over time. So something that was the signifier of one tribe 4 years ago might be the signifier of another tribe today, because actually these tribes are not ideological. They're more like sports teams. And the expectation of the fans is unquestioning loyalty to the party, to the leadership, rather than to ideas or principles. And that is very tragic as well. And this mentality that the personal is the political, I see as one of the greatest potential obstacles to transhumanism in the future. Because if something within our movement, within the movement that holds the improvement of the human condition through science and technology, becomes associated with either the red tribe or the blue tribe, then the other tribe will despise it and will try to oppose it. Already, I think 2 groups will oppose transhumanism. These groups have also been growing in recent years as a result of the polarization, and they are the extreme ends of this polarized political spectrum. The so-called alt-right conspiracy theorists, people like Alex Jones, who see transhumanism as the machinations of a nefarious global elite. And they have all of these elaborate conspiracy theories about transhumanism, which have absolutely no relation to what actual transhumanists think, and they instead attribute the label of transhumanist to people who are not transhumanist, and then they sometimes invent falsehoods about those people and organizations as well. And on the other side of this polarized spectrum, we see the far left militant egalitarians who see transhumanism as only being for the rich. So they think if technologies of radical life extension are attained, then only the ultra wealthy individuals will be able to afford them and will leave the rest of the people behind. So I think it is important to diffuse opposition from both of these groups before that opposition becomes extreme and politically entrenched. Because if we don't respond to these kinds of attacks, if we don't take the effort to educate the public about what transhumanism actually stands for, then those groups who mischaracterize it might win by default just by controlling the terms that are used. And as an example of this, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, recently banned lab-grown meat or in vitro meat, which is meat that is biologically identical to meat that comes from animals, except it can be mass-produced in a lab setting, and it doesn't involve the killing of an animal. So it's a more ethical, more humane way of being able to consume meat products, I think. And the US Transhumanist Party also holds that this is a tremendous advancement and a possibility to achieve a lot of good in the world. But Ron DeSantis banned lab-grown meat in part based on the influence of these alt-right conspiracy theorists who completely mischaracterized what this meat is. They seem to think that transhumanism is associated with the World Economic Forum and some conspiracy to force people to eat protein made out of insects. Of course, both of those statements are false. Transhumanists have not had much overlap at all with the World Economic Forum, nor do either transhumanists or the World Economic Forum really advocate insect consumption by humans. So this ban, which is going to have very real consequences in Florida, is a prime example of what can happen if egregious misconceptions are not addressed quickly. But transhumanism can also overcome this polarization. So true information about transhumanism can help de-escalate tensions and can help bring people closer together by showing them a set of aspirations that they have in common, because transhumanism is not left-wing, it is not right-wing, it is up-wing. And up-wing is a concept first coined by the proto-transhumanist thinker FM-2030, who wrote primarily during the 1960s through the 1990s. Because transhumanism can provide a new sense of meaning and purpose. It can rekindle confidence in progress by emphasizing goals that are in the common interests of humanity and could benefit everyone. Goals such as radical life extension. Human lifespans can be extended for all people of all national, ethnic backgrounds, of all socioeconomic levels, of all genders, all lifestyle choices. The technologies of biotechnology, nanotechnology, emerging medical procedures, rejuvenation therapies, those can benefit everyone if they are allowed to flourish and if they are allowed to be provided by a vibrant, competitive market. We can achieve material abundance through emerging technologies of production. Think of advances in automation and 3D printing, including of large structures. Molecular manufacturing, also vertical farming is another example of a technology of abundance. Intelligence augmentation can be both external through devices such as our phones and computers, as well as wearables and AI applications, including large language models, as well as other approaches toward creating AIs. They can also be internal. They can be modifications to the human body, for instance, artificial organs or artificial limbs, or they can be rejuvenation treatments that help people make the most of their existing bodies and hopefully rejuvenate them to overcome biological aging. Augmentation can be both through technology, through machines, as well as through the superior application of reason and logic. We can achieve improved societal cooperation and the avoidance and resolution of conflicts through both technology and applied rationality. And of course, transhumanism focuses on mitigating and eliminating existential risks, threats like asteroid impacts or nuclear war or supervolcanoes or long-term effects of climate change that can affect all human beings adversely. Now, in terms of particular technologies that transhumanism advocates in order to achieve those goals, here is a list, and I mentioned some of these already in terms of biotechnology, approaches toward life extension, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence. Space colonization is another area that can be greatly inspiring and motivating, and also make sure that we as a species do not put all of our metaphorical eggs in one basket. Seasteading, construction of settlements on the ocean surface, modular floating platforms that can offer experiments and governance. I mentioned vertical farming. Transhumanists also support economical alternative energy, investments in solar energy, next generation nuclear energy. By the way, China has just authorized the construction of a thorium nuclear reactor, which will be hopefully operational in just a few years. Investments in geothermal energy, automation of production. Autonomous and electric vehicles can save lives and also ensure greater energy abundance. Flying cars can enable much greater opportunities for rapid transport. Advances in virtual reality and augmented reality, advances in encryption for ensuring individual privacy, blockchains, cryptocurrencies, smart contracts, and distributed or decentralized autonomous organizations, some of which have already formed in the longevity space and in the cryonics space as well, and ectogenesis, artificial wombs, to solve some fairly thorny social issues like the abortion issue, which is polarizing a lot of American society now and other societies in the Western world as well. But beyond the inspiration that transhumanism provides, we need practical action in order to actually reform the system. And I mentioned Duverger's law in the previous discussion of the causes of polarization. There's a way to overcome it, which is to advocate for electoral reforms such as ranked preference voting or ranked choice voting, as well as open primaries, which are not limited to particular members of a given political party, and proportional representation, which means that not just the candidate with the most votes or the party with the most votes will get representation in the legislative body, but the representation considers also the preferences of the minorities that voted, people who might have expressed preference for a candidate, but that candidate got 10% of the vote, or another candidate got 25% of the vote. And there should be some representation for those as well. Now, ranked choice voting is quite promising, and it's already in use in the United States. The states of Maine and Alaska have held referenda where the voters have approved the use of ranked choice voting for most elections, including the presidential elections. And it's also used in 45 cities, including large cities like Salt Lake City and Seattle. Furthermore, it is used by the US Transhumanist Party in its internal votes. So the premise is one rank orders one's candidates in the order of preference. And here we see an example of a very simple ranked choice ballot with 3 candidates. So this individual marked candidate B as their first choice, candidate A as their second choice, and candidate C as their third choice. So suppose candidate B gets the fewest votes and is eliminated, but no candidate gets a majority of 50%. So a plurality is not enough to win. Instead, what happens then is a series of instant runoffs where the eliminated candidate's first choice votes are reassigned to the second preferences of the voters who supported that candidate. So if candidate B is eliminated, this person's vote would then go to candidate A upon the second round. And what this allows people to do is avoid the lesser evil trap, because if they think one of the major party's candidates is still less evil than the other, they could rank order their preferences accordingly, but also put in first place the candidate they actually support and find closest alignment with. So importantly, in Nevada, ballot question 3 is going to be on the ballot for the second time in 2024, because it passed once already in 2022, but the Nevada Constitution requires these initiatives to be passed twice in order to come into effect. So there are a lot of special interests advocating against this ballot question, but the Transhumanist Party strongly supports it. It would allow for open primaries and ranked choice voting in the general election among the top 5 candidates, which I think would open so many possibilities for candidates outside of the duopoly in the United States to participate. And for those who want to learn more about how ranked choice voting works, I would encourage you to watch our virtual Enlightenment Salon with the representatives of Fair Vote Washington. And they also provided quite a thorough demonstration of a modified approach called proportional ranked choice voting, which combines ranked choice voting and proportional representation. So moving on, I did articulate some ideas in my presentation from 2022 that I would like to revisit in terms of how the transhumanist movement in particular, and the broader community that is adjacent to transhumanism, so I would include in that anybody who favors life extension or longevity, anybody who considers themselves a futurist or a techno-optimist, how can this community become better organized and more effective at achieving specific goals? Because we have many world-class thinkers here, but we're organizationally spread thin and lacking in the capacity to implement public-facing projects. I think we, in terms of the broad movement, have the correct ideas already, or at least these ideas are much better than those that dominate the status quo. Certainly, if people within our movement were in positions of greater influence or even power, these problems of polarization would not be manifesting nearly to the same extent. But we need people who actually are willing to do the work to implement some of these ideas. And I really think it could take as few as 15 rigorously trained implementers, as I call these individuals, to work tirelessly to instantiate these ideas in highly visible ways and in a coordinated, systematic fashion. So these are people who would take some of the many project ideas that have been circulated and discussed over the past few years and would actually try to put them into practice. But how do we find them? How do we motivate these kinds of individuals, especially because time seems to be the most scarce of all resources? And of course, we know this from the standpoint of the pursuit of life extension and how important we consider it to give us more time through the reversal of aging. But even availability of time in the immediate future, given how spread thin so many people are, especially in responding to the various troubles of the past several years. How do we find people who have the time, who have the motivation, and who are willing to take these projects on? I think also to motivate these people and to make sure they know what they're doing, we need a training program for the implementers. And I think it would be worthwhile to assemble some course material for them that would be free and readily available online. So some examples would be David Wood's Vital Syllabus, educational modules that we have gradually been developing through the Transhuman Club, excerpts from our weekly virtual enlightenment salons. If we could create shorter video segments that teach specific ideas, we have certainly discussed a plethora of them during the salons, as well as transhumanist wikis. And there are some that already exist, but there will be additional news regarding how those are going to progress in the future. And I hope that those news will be available soon. But broader theoretical discussions need to be integrated with analyses of current events from a transhumanist standpoint. There's not enough of that happening right now. Artistic and cultural creations, when I mentioned this in 2022, this was essentially right at the time that DALL-E 2 and Midjourney were emerging. And now we've had a veritable artistic renaissance brought about by generative AI models. And I've seen some amazing possibilities for creating art, creating music, creating videos, creating interactive products using combinations of these AI systems. Also, we need to develop roadmaps and regular status updates on the status of various emerging technologies. The Rejuvenation Roadmap that is hosted by Lifespan.io is a great example of one such approach, but we need others for various other realms of technological advancements, as well as projects within the transhumanist community. And all of this is extremely ambitious, but I think we need to do it in the relatively short term to overcome these urgent problems facing the broader civilization, such as the problem of polarization. Some new thoughts along these lines are we need to leverage emerging technologies to help these implementers. And generative AI has really advanced significantly in the past 2 years. So it should be harnessed to achieve results at scale, but we also need to be wary of these technologies' limitations. For instance, the tendency toward hallucinating certain content, or perhaps the art might, in certain cases, be unrealistic or provide us certain kinds of features that we might not want. So there always have to be humans providing curation and quality control in order to have a coherent movement that actually espouses the ideas that its advocates intend to espouse. Now, I think project-specific implementers who focus on one project or just a couple of projects can work quite well, but they will need specific reasons to champion those specific projects. And it could be as simple as we pay them money to do that, but money is always in limited supply as well. So there could be other reasons that they might be personally passionate about those particular implementations of transhumanism, and we need to find the correct people to match with the correct projects. For some projects, it may be possible to take in relatively fresh volunteers and design the project such that we can provide detailed instructions or templates for action that can be adopted by others and scaled up as well. But for other projects, we also need to find people with good judgment, because you can't just essentially create a list of steps for every particular action. There's a lot of tacit knowledge that needs to be utilized to operate at a higher order level. And then also people who are knowledgeable about the history, the principles of the transhumanist community, as well as particular technical skill sets. They are going to be necessary to implement some of these more advanced projects. And of course, we need a strong work ethic so that people don't flame out and they don't just half-heartedly start doing something and not carry through. And furthermore, we need to develop organizational cultures that discourage polarization over mainstream issues, so that transhumanists and people adjacent to transhumanists don't start demonizing and alienating one another because mass media from the red tribe or the blue tribe try to push them to do that and infiltrate our movement and inject this polarization into it. So we need to figure out ways to prevent our organizations from falling prey to propaganda from larger and far better funded entities whose agendas stoke polarization. Because if we let them, these entities will act in an all-consuming fashion and will create discord within our communities as well. But I wanted to illustrate now an example of what I think is a highly effective approach at a transhumanist project where we do have just a small number of implementers. And this is a project which actually originated in 2014. And it was originated by a different team of people who wanted to create a game to illustrate the concept of longevity escape velocity and how it might actually be arrived at in practice to dispel some misconceptions that are still widely held in the general public. For instance, the idea that there might be an immortality pill, or that a person will just keep getting frailer and more vulnerable, but just not die somehow, and show that really the attainment of longevity escape velocity will be an incremental process, and it will at no point in time lead to indestructibility, but people would achieve rejuvenation of their biological ages, and they would achieve the ability to live much longer by leveraging a sequence of technologies and benefiting from combination treatments that target the various types of aging-related damage. So in 2020, I contacted the original team that developed this game, and they had essentially moved on to other things, even though I offered them essentially the rest of the funding that they were seeking to bring this game to fruition. And they had even said that they would allow me to utilize all of the assets that were developed for the original version of the game, but they had lost the code of the game. So I would have to redesign the logic of the game from scratch. And I did that. I transformed the game into a turn-based game that actually relies on real-world probabilities of death by age and gender from the 2018 mortality tables published by the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, in the United States. And of course, moving into the future, I have to make certain assumptions about the effects of particular therapies that haven't been developed yet. But there are also lifestyle choices that a character could make, like a fitness regimen or improved nutrition, or, as you can see here, risk aversion. And the character can also engage in advocacy to affect the probability of external events, such as certain technologies arising that might give the character access to longevity therapies, or could give the character access, for instance, to an AI assistant to boost productivity. There could also occur events in the game such as world wars and pandemics and other detrimental occurrences, natural disasters, for instance. and the character has the option to work to advocate to reduce the risk of those. And this is intended to be a simulation of the future as it will unfold, including the challenges that will affect our probabilities of survival and flourishing in the years and decades to come. So this game was funded by me, and I found a young programmer from Croatia named Juraj Stern-Vukotic, who has coded now approximately 75% of the game. The game is playable. Anybody who wants to get the latest demo version of the game is welcome to contact me, and I will send you the zip file that you could open and install on your PC and play the game as a beta tester. You can already reach longevity escape velocity within this game and experience the far future, but we welcome new suggestions. And I think the reason why this project has been successful is because I was able to find an individual who was very competent in coding the game and understanding how it works and being willing to work through the various bugs as well as user suggestions to create a product that really matches the original intent. And he is going to continue to work on this until the project is finished. And I paid him an amount of money that we agreed upon that is good for a person in his situation. So for him, the motivation was a combination of a monetary payment and the interest in the idea and in making a creative and innovative game concept work as intended. So can we find other people, either volunteers or people who are willing to take small amounts of money to implement other projects within the transhumanist space that could really raise the profile of our movement, make sure we are more prominent so we can affect the broader culture and help defuse some of this polarization. And with that, I invite any and all of you, wherever you are in the world, to join us at transhumanist-party.org/membership or join the Transhuman Club. Membership in both organizations is completely free, and you can find the links to sign up on each of our websites that are provided here. Whether you live in or outside of the United States, you would be able to contribute to our deliberations, to our internal votes. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to vote in US elections if you don't reside in or have eligibility to vote in the United States, but you would still be what is called an allied member, and you would be able to volunteer for us, or you would be able to give us ideas about projects that might be effective in spreading the reach of transhumanism. I believe that transhumanism, in order to succeed, must be a truly international movement and should cultivate the emergence of transhumanist circles and social groups and activist groups anywhere in the world where there is interest. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Gennady, thank you very much for your presentation. It was a very good introduction to the contemporary problems of transhumanism. Thank you very much. One more about my question about presenting the game, the LEV game. We are highly interested to it. I will suggest at least 2 suggestions in a minute. But first of all, is there any questions or comments on Gennady's presentation, please? Not for the moment. So I am going also to give my additional comments about ranking correlation methods. It's something that is very close to my heart because long ago, 2000 years ago, when I was a student, my first research, published research, was in the field of using ranking methods in setting goals of automating welding procedures. Since then, every single student of ours, me and junior, is trained to use ranking methods for different purposes. It is part of the educational process on one of our subjects. So I am fully in favor of your suggestion for using them in the political context. Junior is doing almost every year a comparison between the political programs of the Bulgarian political parties via ranking methods with very interesting results. So ranking methods is a great idea, and we are 100% supporting and practicing that direction. I fully agree that that's the method of making political decisions leading to a better consensus. So against the tendency of polarization. Another more important topic, for me more important, is a left game. One option, as a part of the social activity in this conference, we have the practice to play collectively games in the evenings or late afternoons for 5 o'clock tea, something like that. Would you mind to play that game? Not today, but in the coming days, probably Friday, here in the conference, as beta testers, yes, but also as a collective experience of the conference. And the second point, I was on your demonstration, so I have a good idea about the game. As you know, we are trying our efforts. You are also contributing to the great transhumanist game of everything, or about everything. At the moment, we have a step toward that, a game called Bulgarian Yogurt Business Game, developed in 2020. Up to the moment, it is run 8 times in Bulgarian and in English, 2 publications, not very much, but it is designed to accept many different games as a sub-assignments for the players. For example, at the moment we have a set of 16 games for human resources selection. There is such a company of ex-students of us who is using games for selecting proper people for the clients. So all students are supposed to play these games as being incorporated in our big game. So I see left as a potentially possible to be incorporated as an additional assignment to the teams of students, because in the game there is a lot of longevity and transhumanist aspects. So that's the second idea. So would you mind to do that in November, when is the nearest, it is scheduled, the nearest run of the game, of our game?
I think that's an excellent idea to have LEV the game included as a module in the Great Transhumanist game. And absolutely, I would be happy to take part in that in November when that is underway. And in the meantime, I have also shared the link to the latest build of the game, which is build 0.75. So if you access the Google Drive file, it will prompt you to download a zip file. You can install it onto a PC and test it out. You can even test it out at this conference, either individually or within a group setting if you want to sit by a computer and collectively decide the actions that your character will take. That might be an interesting experience. It might motivate some interesting discussions as well. I have, as you pointed out, done some video demonstrations of the game where I asked the audience, even via the YouTube chat or the chat in Zoom, to suggest actions that the character should take next. And I would pick essentially the first suggestion from any audience member as the next action that the character would take. And we would see with the combination of those actions whether this character would survive or die. And it is possible for the character to die, including sometimes if the character had made most of the right choices, to illustrate this unfortunate element of realism. But I think it would be excellent to try out this game in as many different settings as possible. I am planning to make it available completely for free, including the finished version, precisely because I want it to spread, precisely because I want people everywhere in the world of every demographic to try to understand this set of concepts of longevity escape velocity, of transhumanism, of the confluence of emerging technologies, and really envision how a future might unfold with all of these ideas in play.
Okay. In this case, I assume that you are part of the game in November. It will be with approximately 160 participants, split in about 30 teams. And you will be part of a video newspaper saying something very short about the game, and then they will have the chance to make some points. The game is for making points via playing the game as an additional assignment in parallel with all other assignments in the game. So I will contact you in November to set up. It will be Saturday, Sunday as days of the week. The game is taking place on end of the weeks. Okay, other questions and comments? I'm very happy that we have agree about that. It will be a valuable contribution. Thank you very much again, Gennady.